Hello, today I'm looking at a third Rioja from Campo Viejo. The wine I have to show you is Campo Viejo's 2022 Tempranillo. And I just have a bottle next to it there of the Reserva, which was my previous tasting, just to really show how the two bottles can look very similar on the shelf. You actually have to sort of be reading the label relatively carefully to see which is which. And so what I'll try and do in today's tasting is to do a little bit of explaining as to what the difference between these two wines is, and so as to sort of give a reason for the difference in price between those two wines as well. So just to give some background for Campo Viejo, the largest producer of Rioja, based in Logrono. Evidently they make about 10% of Rioja's entire production, and that's somewhere in the region of 15 million bottles of wine a year. The company was founded in 1959 by three businessmen, Jose Otiguela, Bernardo Beristan and Juan Alcorta, and they gave the brand the name Campo Viejo, meaning old fields, as a sort of an homage to the old vineyards that grew around the village of El Vilar de Arnedo in what was then Rioja Baja, which evidently is where Jose Otiguela grew up. Now, initially Campo Viejo was part of the SAVIN group of wineries, and SAVIN principally existed to produce, blend, bottle and distribute everyday table wine, both throughout Spain and internationally. Now, the SAVIN group went on to be acquired and become part of Bodegas y Bibedas, who were a group of wineries who went on to become Spain's largest wine producers. In 2001, Bordegas y Bibedas themselves were taken over by Allied Domecq. And they're only owned by Allied Domecq for 4 years, because in 2005, Pernod Ricard, the large French-based wine and spirits group, acquired Campo Viejo as part of a takeover of Allied Domecq. Campo Viejo stayed in the hands of Pernod Ricard for 20 years, until last year when Accolade Wines and the majority of Pernod Ricard's wine division were merged to form a company called Vinarchy, when Accolade's parent company, Wine Holdco Limited, purchased most of Pernod Ricard's wine brands. Now, initially, Campo Viejo's success stemmed from the fact that it was created as an inexpensive Rioja brand that was positioned to appeal to the mass market at a time when supermarkets were quite a new distribution channel in Spain. Prior to this, most of the wines of Rioja had been sold in restaurants. Now, probably another reason for the brand's popularity was the fact that the basic wine in the Campo Viejo brand was a Crianza, and that was complemented, of course, by a Reserva, a Gran Reserva, a white and a rosé. But this served to help showcase the idea that red Rioja was a barrel-aged style of wine. Evidently they did have an unaged wine as well, but that was sold as another brand. Unsurprisingly, given its positioning, Campo Viejo was one of the first Rioja brands to have real international success, and that also helped the brand to grow to its now preeminent position. And today Campo Viejo is sold in 70 countries, and they have one of the largest wineries in the Rioja region. Now, this winery was opened in 2001 at about the same time as Allied Domecq were acquiring the company, and the new winery was viewed both as innovative and also as having highly sustainable principles. Built in Logrono, the design featured massive underground cellars that had been dug back into a hill, helping to keep the cellars cool and maintain stable temperatures, thus reducing the need for temperature control and air conditioning. The winery was designed to be entirely gravity fed, so that the fruit was delivered at the top of the winery, where it was sorted, crushed, destemmed, and went by gravity into the fermenting tanks, and then could be moved by gravity down into the aging cellars. Primarily, this is done to negate the use of pumps in producing the wine. Pumping grape must can actually be quite brutal in breaking up the pips and the skins, and can give some harsh flavours. However, of course, this also has the added benefit of reducing energy usage. But that isn't a problem anyway, because from the outset this facility has been entirely powered by renewable energy. Now, Campo Viejo have made sure that they've maintained their leadership role in sustainability for the Rioja area. Evidently in 2011 they were the first winery to certify their carbon footprint, and then in 2012 they went on to achieve carbon neutral certification. Now, being a large winery, Campo Viejo have to source fruit as well as growing it themselves, so they work with over 500 growers from the local area, sourcing grapes from about 6,400 hectares, as well as having a further 230 hectares of estate vineyards. Now, I understand that this wine is produced with fruit coming from all three of the sub-regions of Rioja, so Rioja Alta, Rioja Alevesa and Rioja Oriental, or Baja as I referred to it earlier, which is its former naming. And this approach enables the winemakers to combine characteristics of the fruit from these different zones, such as the additional acidity you'll get from the higher elevation sites in, say, Alta and possibly Alevesa, with body and alcohol from the warmer, lower elevation sites. And this ability to combine these different characteristics enables the winemakers to provide elegance, complexity, and a certain amount of consistency in the wine style between vintages. Now, the summer of 2022 arrived really fast and furious. Temperatures soared, and some regions only saw something like a quarter of their normal annual rainfall for the entire season. And in places, the resulting drought caused vines to shut down. The hot, dry weather did at least keep rot and disease away. The resulting fruit was highly concentrated, but yields were down. The harvest also took place extremely early as a result of winemakers picking earlier to try and retain acidity and delicate perfumes in the fruit. Overall, despite the challenges of the very hot weather, challenges that are becoming more and more regular to the winemakers of Rioja, there were some potentially really good wines made in the Rioja region in 2022. Given the fact that this is not an expensive wine, I think it's almost certain that the majority of the fruit would have been harvested by machine, but that's not something that the producer's notes say anything about. I would sort of expect them to say if the fruit was being hand harvested, because that would be exceptional. And that's probably our first difference from the Reserva Rioja, where it would be my assumption that a much larger proportion of the fruit would be picked by hand, just to allow a higher degree of selection and more gentle handling. Fermentation for the Tempranillo takes place in stainless steel tanks. That's the same as for the Reserva. However, the Reserva was allowed to ferment at 28 degrees, whereas the Tempranillo is only fermented at 25 degrees. I think with the idea of extracting softer tannins and retaining more of the wine's aromatics. Now, the fruit went on to macerate in the juice and the fermenting wine in tank for 12 days. So that's less than is the case for the Reserva, where maceration was allowed to go on for 20 days. So again, that's less extractive. So we're expecting a wine that will be less tannic here. Unsurprisingly, for a wine labelled as Tempranillo, this is 100% Tempranillo. Whereas in the Reserva, the winemakers combine that Tempranillo with Graciano and Malzuelo to produce extra complexity, more structure, better acidity that will hopefully allow the wine to age for longer. Once the wine had undergone its malolactic conversion, it then goes into barrel. This is entirely aged in American oak barrels, whereas I believe the Reserva was aged 50-50 of American and French oak. And the difference there is that the American oak will tend to give more obvious, spicy vanilla notes than the French oak, which tends to give more elegant tannic structure. The period of aging is also much shorter. Tempranillo, as a style of wine called a Joven, only spends 4 months in barrel, whereas the Reserva had spent 18 months there. Hopefully what I'm showing there is that all the winemaking around the Tempranillo is geared towards making it this Joven, this lightly oaked style of wine that is much more fruit driven, that is not as a wine that's designed to be tannic, to have the ability to age for a long period. It is supposed to be approachable from the time of release. And the notes that I've seen about this suggest its optimum drinking is probably 1 to 3 years from now, and its maximum aging potential is probably just 5 years, because after that it's likely to lose much of its aromatic, fruity character. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? The colour differs slightly, both from that of the Reserva and the Gran Reserva. This has quite a dark ruby red. It's not massively deep, it probably has a medium intensity, but it seems to have slightly more depth than either of those other wines because it's spent less time aging in barrel. The wine is labelled as having 13% alcohol, and it's quite readily throwing tears on the glass there. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? There's a richness, a ripeness and a warmth, an almost slightly chocolatey warmth, to some relatively concentrated red fruit aromas. There are notes of really ripe red plum, concentrated cherry, perhaps glacier cherry, dried cranberry. Then behind that there's some delicate notes of spice, a little bit of nutmeg particularly, and then following on from that some vanilla. There are perhaps also some slightly savoury notes, maybe a touch of mushroom, maybe a hint of forest floor. There's quite an agreeable complexity to what I'm finding on the nose. So let's have a taste. On the palate, the wine has some quite good acidity. It's got some nice vibrancy. It's giving a juiciness. And again, I think it's the Tempranillo is really quite on the front of my tongue. There's some gripping, spicy tannin. So there's this juicy red fruit, hints of mulberry and damson combining there. The freshness and the spiciness of the mulberry combined with something of the sort of the slightly velvety texture and richness of the damson. And the combination of the acidity and those fine tannins is leaving me with quite a clean, mouth-watering sensation on the middle of my tongue. Compared to the Reserva, the wine is much more one-dimensional. It is that sort of spicy red fruit that's coming from the Tempranillo. It doesn't have those extra dimensions that the Graciano and the Mauzuelo bring to the wine. The oak character is showing nicely. There's good structure, but it's not overpowering the fruit. While the finish is not very long, it's got reasonable length, and it's showing that juicy, slightly mulberry and dried cranberry sort of red fruit, and its harmoniously melded spicy hints relatively well on the finish. The alcohol isn't intruding. In fact, in honesty, if this wine had an extra 0.5% of alcohol, it might just round out the finish a little more. On the other hand, the alcohol as it is allowing that elegant fruit just to linger quite delicately on the finish. Found this quite an interesting comparison. The wine doesn't have the depth, intensity or structure of the Reserva, and I certainly don't see it as a wine that needs any additional time in the cellar. It's drinking very nicely now. However, I am impressed, particularly on the aromas, but on the finish as well, as to how it's showing a lot of the character of the Tempranillo and just enough of the spicy oak to show that this is a barrel-aged red Rioja. I took a look at the Wine Searcher aggregated critics score for this wine, and it's getting 87 out of 100. Now, when I first saw that and when I first tasted the wine, I wondered if that was being a little generous, but actually it's just opened up in the glass and it's showing a little bit more elegance, finesse, spice and Tempranillo character. I do actually think that that 87 out of 100 is justified as a score, and it is worth comparing this price-wise with the Reserva. As a result, I will leave a link to the Wine Searcher webpage for this wine so that you can see how much it costs in your market and also, of course, where it's available. So yes, this is a wine I've been quite impressed to try, which seems to be offering some reasonable quality and some really nice Tempranillo and Rioja character at a decent price. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, I would be very grateful if you'd press the like button. That would be great. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, perhaps I could ask, could you forward it to them? I think that would be a fantastic endorsement coming from you. Can I also ask, if you've been watching these videos and you haven't yet subscribed, you perhaps consider signing up? Having a larger follower base would greatly enhance my ability to develop the channel further. And at that stage as well, you can also set yourself an alert so that you can be notified every time I publish a new tasting, and that way you can't miss any. Finally, if you have any comments or questions, do please put those in the comments box below. I would love to know what you think about the tastings I'm doing, the wines I'm looking at, or anything else related to them. So finally, thank you so much for giving up your time to join me, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to find some time in the near future and come and join me for another tasting. But until then, bye for now.